Rip, welcome to Stetson College of Law in St. Petersburg,
Thank
Florida.
you. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Let's start with the general history of the Nashville movement as you became involved in it. Could you tell us a little bit about the beginning of the movement and the nature of those activities?
Well, prior to the Freedom Ride, we had the sit-ins. And before the sit-ins, there were workshops. And before the workshop, the Nashville group, SCLC, and quite possibly SNCC, took 2 years to plan what we were going to do in the sit-ins. And we were very fortunate to have Jim Lawson to teach us about nonviolence and what to do when you were attacked, how to protect yourself, and most of all, not to hit back. And that's what nonviolence is all about.
Now, Reverend Lawson's workshops were a direct reflection of his Gandhian philosophy. Could you tell us a little bit about the philosophical nature of nonviolent protest and where this came from?
Well, passive resistance, and Dr. Lawson had a chance to go to and study with Gandhi, and he brought that back to Nashville with him. It was a godly mission, and I think that the sit-ins, as well as the Freedom Rides, were a godly mission because of the people that we had as our lieutenants, you might say, such people as Diane Nash, James Bevel, John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, C.T. Vivian. These people had different agendas before they came to Nashville, and their agenda did not include Nashville. I think Diane was the only one, and perhaps maybe John Lewis. John Lewis wanted to go to school in Alabama, and Dr. King, I believe, gave him a scholarship to come to ABT. But the rest had different agendas, but for some reason they were all put together in Nashville and formed the SNCC group, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and came up with all these ideas about what we should do and when and where.
Now, the Lawson workshops were generally led by his training, his discussion with you about Gandhian philosophy and nonviolent protest, but the students themselves did the training sessions. Could you describe for us what a typical training session was like?
Dr. Lawson would talk to us. We would be sitting, whether it's at a church or at Fisk University in one of the classrooms. He would talk to us about nonviolence and civil non-resistance. And then we would set up what we would call a lunch counter. We would have chairs or stools. Students would be sitting in these chairs or stools, and there would be other students behind them actually hitting them, not hard, but just letting them know what to expect. They might pour some sugar on them or put cigarettes on them, things like this, so that you would know what to expect. And then how to defend yourself. And I don't mean defend yourself violently, but how to defend yourself without having someone kick your teeth out or breaking a rib. Do the best you can to defend yourself without striking back.
This must have been a rather novel idea from the beginning, because you were preparing yourselves for the reality that you would be attacked when you participated in sit-ins, maybe theater desegregations, and even street marches.
In Nashville, on one of the sit-ins, the police were slow to come to our rescue, and they gave the people who were just walking up and down the aisles behind us, the bullies, they gave them a chance to do some damage, like put a cigarette out on your arm or pour some sugar or whatever was on the counter, pour water over you, and you had to sit there and not know, and you couldn't turn around to look at someone to see what they were going to do to you. You were focused straight ahead. You were concerned about the person to your left or to your right that was on the sit-in with you. And it's one of those things where you just said, I'm going to turn the other cheek. I think that's the best way I can put it.
Take us back a bit and set the stage for what it was like to sit at a lunch counter during the movement, the beginning of the Nashville movement, or to begin the desegregation of the theaters, knowing where your image of segregation had come from. Take us back to the childhood image of segregation, and then how it felt to be participating in a movement to desegregate the places that you weren't allowed to go to as a child.
Okay. For example, the area I lived in, the buses were segregated. There was a line on the floor, and there were signs on the front of the bus and also at the back of the bus. Whites only up front, and then there was a line on the floor that blacks couldn't cross because they would be, and the blacks had to sit in the back. One of the things that Dr. Lafayette says about that, there was an advantage to sitting in the back. In the summertime, it was a disadvantage, but in the wintertime, it was an advantage because the big diesel engine is in the back, so the back of the bus was always warm in the wintertime. But as a child growing up, I grew up in a neighborhood that was changing from the whites were moving out and moving further into West Nashville. So this opened up housing for blacks to move in that particular area. And there was one young man that his family was white and they lived behind us. And he was my classmate, my playmate. And we didn't know anything about segregation, as far as the fact that I wasn't supposed to play with him and he wasn't supposed to play with me. And he went to a movie theater. His sister took him to the movie theater downtown. Everything was downtown. There were no shopping malls in the 50s and 60s. So you had to go downtown to see the movies or to do your shopping and whatever it was, whatever business you had to take care of, you went downtown. And the young man told me about a movie at one of the big theaters. And my mother took me to this movie, and as we were approaching the theater, I went for the front door. And she let me know that I couldn't go in the front door. And I wanted to know why, because my friend had told me, just go in the front door and I would see all the things that he had described in the movie theater. But we didn't have a chance to go in the front door because it was a segregated movie. Now, blacks went to the movies downtown, but they had to go in a different door and they had to go all the way up into the balcony. And I always remember that we always had to look down. It was almost like looking down between your knees to see the movie because you were so high up in the theater. And I think with that, and not only with me, but a lot of people who were in the movement found something from their childhood that said, okay, now is the time to right a wrong. Once they became high school age or college age.
Could you describe the character or dynamics of a typical event?
Okay, the students would meet at the church, which was probably 4 or 5 blocks from the main part of the downtown area. And we would send a wave of students to, say, one of the stores like Crest's 5 and 10 cent store. And they would order coffee or a sandwich or whatever they wanted to order, but they were not served. And then the police came and arrested them. And so when the first wave of students were arrested, there was a second wave of students ready to take their places at the lunch counters. So the police department thought that once they arrested the first group, that was it for the day. And by the time they would take those students to jail, they'd probably get another phone call and say, we've got another group that's sitting here.
And this was not random. This was a part of Gandhian philosophy.
Yes.
John Lewis writes in his book, Walking with the Wind, that as one wave were taken to jail, another wave was behind them. And this was deliberate. This was a part of the whole theme of nonviolent protest.
Yes, and we were there to fill the jails. And one of the good things about being organized was that some of the adults with the young people, college students coming to sit in, they were from all over this nation. And so the parents heard that their children were being arrested. And so they have made arrangements so that when the parents would come into Nashville, which a lot of parents came to Nashville to see about their children, they had a phone number that they could call and talk to one of the adults, and the adults would explain to them exactly what was going on, that these kids were doing something that we should have done years ago. And the parents accepted that. A lot of parents put up money for the bail. Our attorneys did not charge us anything. Miss Leonard, who was the mother of Joy Leonard and Freddie Leonard, she put her house up for bail money, not just for her kids, but for wherever they needed it. And there were a lot of people in high places that could not sit at a lunch counter, but they made their checks and their money available to us. A lot of the doctors at Meharry and a lot of the school teachers who were in favor of what was going on. And then there were some who wanted to know, why are you doing this? But after a few weeks, they understood what it was all about. And so we had to sit in, and it was getting close to Easter, and we decided to do an economical boycott, and it was 100% successful. And a lot of success that we had came from some of the wives of members of the Chamber of Commerce, because the chamber would meet and strategize, and then a husband would come home and his wife would want to know how the day was and what happened at the meeting, and he would tell her, and what you going to do tomorrow about these students, and he would tell her that, and then we'd get a phone call. And another thing is, while we were being arrested, and when they set the trial dates, some of the wives from the judges, the various judges, came to the trial and sat right down on the front row to, I guess, to look at their husbands to see, what are you going to do? And because they were on our side, a lot of the wives. And so there were people who had credit cards who tore up their credit cards.
Now, when you say tearing up their credit cards, for young law students of today, these were the days prior to visas and master charges. This was a card that a customer used at that particular store.
Yes.
This was their account relationship with that store.
With that store.
So this was a very personal economic protest of that store.
Yes, at that particular store, yes.
At the time of this sit-in movement, when you began, Brown versus Board had been decided, and the opinion clearly read such that it would be applied beyond education. So in a sense, already the law at the Supreme Court level was on your side. But when you talk about police coming to enforce your removal, you're saying in a sense that Jim Crow laws that were passed under the force of Plessy versus Ferguson before Brown, that was what local authorities perceived the law to be.
That's correct.
They weren't so concerned with Brown. They were concerned with their local law that still preserved the segregation of those facilities by race.
And they were not in a hurry to help us, to keep the mob off of us at all. And I remember watching some footage, and one of the policemen, after the mob had attacked some of the sit-in students, and then he said, "That's enough, leave them alone." There was always a time that there was some free time for the bullies. There was always free time.
So there was no question of direct complicity between law enforcement and local people who were obviously deliberately intending to disrupt you and to attack the movement.
That's correct.
Did the movement automatically produce some sympathetic white reaction? Could you see an upturn in white awareness of what segregation was about? And do you think you, right from the beginning, began to provoke white folks into thinking about what segregation was and
Yes.
question it?
Yes. I remember a young man who came downtown just to see what was going on, total segregationist. But after he saw what was happening and how the students were being beaten, he changed his mind about it. There was an incident, just how you catch people off guard. There was an incident with, I believe, Reverend Lawson doing one of the walk-ins at the movie theater. We were on our way back to the church, and I think he was at the end of the line, and a young man came up and spit on him. And Reverend Lawson said, "Do you have a handkerchief? May I borrow your handkerchief?" And in just that little act, the man just went in his pocket and gave his handkerchief to him. He caught him at the right time. "Do you have a handkerchief?" And his reaction was that he just went in and got his handkerchief so that Reverend Lawson could wipe the spit off. So,
now, in all of the films of the movement, in all of the documentaries, there is a large awareness of the role of black ministers and black churches and of the white clergy in the movement. You've implied that the churches were really the center of activity for meetings, and you've mentioned C.T. Vivian. I know that Reverend Kelly Miller Smith also was very central in terms of that church being a center point of movement meetings and movement strategy. Could you discuss just for a minute the role of clergy and the role of the churches in Nashville in being the central planning and force of the movement?
well, the churches were well informed about what was going on in Nashville. The preachers were. And I would think that some would, I know that my particular church, Gordon Memorial, we had Reverend Lawson would come over and speak to the congregation. And I'm sure that he went around to other churches and spoke to the congregation as to what was going on, what to expect, how the congregation was to react to what the students were doing, to let them know that we needed their finances. If they wanted to participate, they could. Of course, they'd have to go through the training. But really, to assure the older people not to worry, that everything's going to be all right.
And then came the Freedom Rides.
We knew about the Freedom Ride because of John Lewis.
We know that you joined the second wave of students and the first to reach Mississippi.
Yes.
And you joined the ride in Montgomery. What did you know about what had happened to that first wave in Anniston and in Birmingham and in Montgomery?
Well, we were monitoring the progress of the very first Freedom Ride. And we knew about the burning of the bus. We knew about what happened in Birmingham with them getting on the bus and beating the Freedom Riders. We knew about that. We also was talking to Mr. Farmer while they were in Birmingham with Reverend Shuttlesworth. And we knew that they had flown to New Orleans. And Diane was talking to Jim Farmer, and he tried to talk her out of it. I mean, he talked and talked and talked and tried to, it's too dangerous. You see what happened to us, and you're going into Mississippi, and that's even worse. And she simply said that if we stop now, then the enemy will win. He will know that all he has to do is to become very violent, do violent acts, and that we'll give up. And we're not going to give up.
So as the movement turned more violent, in a sense, as white resistance turned even more violent than it had earlier, it increased the resolve of the Freedom Riders, that this was a sign that we now have to, more than ever, continue what
we have
we're doing.
To continue the ride, yes.
Now, the pressure was not just from your elders, like James Farmer, that perhaps things were getting too dangerous. The elders in the movement were starting to talk to the youngsters in the movement that they might be putting their lives on the line here. But the pressure was also coming from the White House and from the National Attorney General.
Yes.
The flight to New Orleans, in fact, had been arranged by John Siegenthaler, the representative of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. And though they helped get that first group to New Orleans, they also were trying to talk you out of out of going on the rides.
Mm-hmm.
Could you describe how you felt about that and how the Freedom Riders responded to the concerns of the national government?
First of all, our lines were tapped. The Attorney General and the President did not want us to continue the Freedom Ride at that time because of their agenda. And I guess they didn't want the world to see what was going on in the United States, and they're trying to do something in other countries. And we were asked not to continue the Freedom Ride.
Now, you joined the ride in Montgomery. Tell us a little about the environment of that ride when you get on a Freedom Ride bus.
Well, first of all, I didn't know that we would have the as many cameras. I thought it would be a regular ride with regular passengers plus the Freedom Riders, but it was not like that at all. We had the National Guard, the Alabama National Guard, on the bus. We had photographers, writers on the bus. They also had the National Guard in front of the bus driving their vehicles and behind the bus, and they had the helicopters in the air. And then when we got to the Alabama-Mississippi state line, then the Mississippi National Guard took over and escorted us on into Jackson, Mississippi. We never made a stop. The only time we stopped was at the state line so that they could make the changes so that the Alabama National Guard could get off the bus and the Mississippi National Guard could get on the bus.
Now, at the time you took this ride, the United States Supreme Court had decided a case called Boynton versus Virginia. It had decided an earlier case, the Irene Morgan case, and had said in both cases that under the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, you had a legal right to do what you were doing, that both interstate buses were to be desegregated, and that a bus terminal, and these were Greyhound and Trailways bus terminals, that the bus terminals of interstate carriers in the United States, even though they were within a state, were required to be desegregated. What happened when you got off the Greyhound bus and went into the Greyhound bus terminal?
Well, I got off with my group. I think there were 13, there were a total of 26, 13 on one bus and 13 on the other bus. And we got off and walked into the waiting room, and we were immediately arrested because they knew that that bus had nothing on it but Freedom Riders. And so we were immediately arrested. We were charged with disorderly conduct. And they had to drop the disorderly conduct, and so we were charged with the breach of peace. We were then escorted to the paddy wagon and booked and photographed and put in a jail cell.
But the real destination was Parchman Prison.
We ended up
there.
in Parchman, but before that, the city jail is being filled, the county jail is about full, and they took the 26 of us again to a different place, and that was the county farm. And the county farm was where the prisoners wore the black and white or the gray and white uniforms with the stripes. And as I've said many times, the food was great. That was the best place that we had. We were there for maybe 2 days while they did the paperwork. And then we were shipped back to the county jail. And I guess they had made arrangements for Parchman Penitentiary at the maximum security unit by that time.
Parchman Prison is a real throwback to a truly old-time Southern maximum security prison.
Yes.
Talk about what it was like. What did it look like? What was it like
Well,
to be there?
we were there when we arrived. They started moving us early in the morning, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. So the ride from Jackson to Parchman was during the night hours. And we got there, I guess about daybreak. And we could see some of the Freedom Riders being taken in to the prison. Some of the riders had been on hunger strikes, and it was hard for them to walk. And the guards, or maybe even the trustees, used cattle prodders to get them to move because they wouldn't pick them up and carry them. And so they used cattle prods on them to get them to move. And once we were checked in, we had
For
to
people who don't know what that is, describe a cattle prod.
something that's 2 metal rods that stick out like this, and one is negative post and one is a positive post. And once they put that to you, you get an electrical shock. And they were using those on the Freedom Riders to get them to move with that electrical shock.
And it was dehumanizing.
Well, after they stripped us down, we were able to, I believe, take a shower, and we were searched, and then we received our shorts and T-shirt, which was made of raw cotton, and it's not like the Hanes that you might be wearing today. This was raw cotton, and it would make you itch. We had, the mattress was probably 2 inches thick on a steel bunk. Your room was 8 by 6, and there were 2 Freedom Riders per cell, and we loved to sing. We were always singing, and singing is something where it's like your enemy might say, I have done everything that I can to you, and you're still singing.
So for about 2.5 minutes in an interstate commerce bus waiting room,
Cost me
under the
62
force
days.
of Supreme Court law, you spent 2 months in a state penitentiary.
Yes.
And then you all drove or boarded trains, and some headed home. Describe the next part of the experience.
I know that when I was released from Parchman, I was by myself. The attorney came up and got me and drove me back to Jackson, and I was put on a train and back to Nashville. Coming back to Nashville, I was able to continue because there was a lot still going on in Nashville. I rejoined the group and was canvassing the area for the 2 large stores at that time, Kroger and H.G. Hills, to get people not to shop until they had hired blacks to be a clerk or to have some kind of position in the store. And we also were boycotting some of the restaurants, white restaurants, well-known restaurants in Nashville, the movie theaters, the city parks for the swimming pool to be able to go swimming.
Now, a part of coming home was that here you were at Tennessee State University. This movement was a student movement. It was a movement of young intellectuals, all of you with majors in college and well on your way to achieving your career and your leadership role and as the next generation. But when you got home, you discovered that one of the other consequences was
that I had been expelled
that
from
governors
school.
and presidents were issuing directives that you should be expelled.
Yes, and I was expelled. The first letter was dated June 1st, 1961, and I was still in jail at that time, and was expelled from Tennessee State along with 13 other students. And so while they were fighting that case, I was still out demonstrating.
So even though basically, again, Supreme Court law was on your side, and you were clearly exercising First Amendment freedoms, the most important of those constitutional rights, nonetheless, your university saw that this was misconduct by students though being a public school, it was subject to that Constitution.
Yes. And the thing about it is that we did not have a hearing from the school. And that was one of the first things that should have happened, was that they should have sat us down and had a hearing before they made that decision.
And that indeed led to a series of cases that said that college students were citizens first. And though schools could have rules about student behavior, those rules could not violate basic constitutional freedoms and your exercise of those freedoms. You mentioned all through this story the word lawyers, and that you had lawyers. You had some awareness of what the NAACP was doing, what Thurgood Marshall was doing at the beginning of the movement after Brown, and then his successors, Jack Greenberg and Constance Baker Motley and others were doing. But you also had local lawyers.
Yes.
Kind of the unsung heroes of the legal profession. And
yes,
you've talked to me about Mr. Luby, and I've talked to you about Arthur Shores in Birmingham. These were lawyers who really risked their life and limb to help you legally. Could you?
Well, our top attorney was the Alexander Luby. We also had an attorney by the name of Avon Williams, Robert Lillard, and others. But these attorneys dedicated their time to our cases. And to my knowledge, there was no fee. They did not ask for a fee.
And in some instances, they were the victims of violence themselves.
Yes, the Alexander Luby, for one, was his house was bombed. Luckily, he and his wife were in the back of the house. That was at 6 o'clock in the morning. By 8 o'clock that morning, I would say that I know that Tennessee State, Fisk, Meharry, Vanderbilt, Scarrett, Peabody, Washington Junior High was in North Nashville, Pearl High was in North Nashville, and some of the other schools. We had a silent march on the downtown area. We marched to the courthouse because we wanted to talk to the mayor. So over 5,000 students marched silently downtown.
As you look at, and as this interview is seen by students like you were today, your protégés in a sense, what would you tell them about the value of being social activists, about really participating at the grassroots level?
Well, as a student, if you, one of the things I think is, if you see something that's wrong in your neighborhood, in your city, or in your state, you have to do some background work on that wrong, and you want to right that wrong. You have to do a lot of background work. Then you find somebody that is in agreement with what it is that you want to do, and you do it nonviolently and spread the word, and you will have people who have been thinking about doing it for years or for months or whatever, and the next thing you know, you've got enough people to actually make a difference. Of course, you have to do a lot of legwork. I believe in legwork, although the cell phone and the computer is good, but when you're one-on-one and talking to people, knocking on doors, I think you get a better results.
Rip, we thank you for the visit. It's been wonderful to have a freedom rider with us for a week.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you very much.